The suspense.
Hi, so I'm Laura Yeager, and we also have Heather Sheffield here, and we have been invited today to talk a little bit about school boards, about school board elections, the Board of Trustees, school bonds, and Heather Vader.
Yes, Vader. Voter approved tax ratification election. But
Excellent. So we're just gonna, run through it for you guys a little, and I really appreciate that we were invited by the League of Women Voters of the Austin area to talk about this. Heather and I are both actively involved with public education advocacy at every level, from local up to the state, really all the way up. And a lot of times when it comes times for elections, people get excited about the presidential election and maybe even a couple things down the ballot, but school board, one, it isn't partisan. You don't know what party people are in, but two, it's at the very bottom of the ballot, and people just don't learn that much about it. So we're excited to help people understand a little bit more about it, what the school board does, how the elections work, and all of that. So, so I'm going to get started, if I can. So one thing that's important to mention is that education is really on the ballot at every level. And I understand that there are voters that I often find that voters engage with whatever is most important to them, but almost everyone in every community is touched by education, whether you are a parent, a student, a teacher, a community member that counts on students that come out of the schools, whether you go to football games, whatever it is, education is the heart of our communities. So it's really important to understand who makes decisions about it. So I've broken it down here, and on the next page, I'm going to tell you really who does what in terms of education, but really from the highest elected official, from the president, down to our school boards. There are decisions that are made every day that affect your communities, that affect all of our children and teachers, and so it's super important. So I'm going to run through this just to help people understand, because again, people don't know the locus of decision making. So for example, at the federal level, they do have a say. Only about 8% of education funding comes at the federal level. The president appoints the Secretary of Education, who is currently Betsy DeVos. Congress allocates education funds, and then they set the parameters for federal testing and accountability requirements. The Senate also actually does have to approve the Secretary of Education. So, and we're voting on people on all those levels coming up this month or next month, depending on if you're voting early or when you're going to vote. Now, the state is responsible for the bulk of education, and so it is one of the top two things that states spend on. Education is a huge expenditure, and it's really something that was allocated in our Constitution predominantly to the states. So 92% of public education funding is decided by the state. Our governor, who is not up for election right now, but will be in 2 years, appoints the Commissioner of Education, who any of you who have kids who are going back to school, the commissioner is making a lot of decisions related to whether your kid goes back to school, to whether they fund the schools. So that commissioner has a lot of power, and that is an appointed position from the governor. The legislature determines how funding is done, what comes from the state, what comes from your local tax dollars. They pass legislation on testing and accountability, whether you take STAR tests, whether they count for graduation, all the different things. So they set the parameters. And then the State Board of Education also is up. So some of the members are up for election. They write the curriculum. They decide what your kids are learning in school, what 5.4 million children are going to learn about. And then they are the ones who approve or deny new charter applications. And then it gets down to the school board. So you're the most locally elected members are our school boards. And it's ironic that people pay less attention to the lowest level because they have the most impact over your everyday life. And you have the most impact over them as well. They are your neighbors and community members. So just to list, and I'm gonna have, there's another slide, I think it'll show this bigger, but the school board trustees have a number of responsibilities. They hire and fire the superintendent. They set the goals for the superintendent. They pass district policies, they work on them, they vote on them. They determine, once the funding comes to you, how it's allocated within the district. And we're gonna give some examples. My children, my youngest just graduated last year, but I had 3 kids go through Austin ISD, which is a very large, complex district. Heather has children in Eanes ISD, which is a very different, it's a different makeup and it's a different size. So they're, and I know the Austin area includes, maybe a dozen different school districts, and they're all a little bit different. They vote on programs and curriculum. They determine bond needs and whether to add them to the ballot. Heather is going to talk about that, and that, setting the tax rate, which affects everyone who is paying taxes. And then they also deal with other legal matters that the district, whether it's a special ed matter, whether it's a teacher matter. So the school boards do a lot. There's a video that there's a link to that people can watch later, but this quote from the Texas Association of School Boards really talks to the fact that that school boards, when they're elected from their communities, they make decisions about educational programs, but based on the needs of the community and the values and the expectations. It's not like set in stone. It's not the same everywhere. They really need to reflect your community's values. And they're entrusted by the public to translate the needs of students. This is about students. I just want to, because not everybody always remembers that, into policies, plans, and goals that'll be supported by the community. And it's super important to recognize that because most students can't vote. You can't vote until you're 18. And so we really have to have great faith in the people we elect for our school board members. This just, breaks down what I had said before. And it's just bigger for people who need to see it, but there's just a lot of responsibilities that school board members have. I'm going to talk, for a few minutes about how elections work. And then we'll give you examples from our districts. And in the Q&A, if people have questions or want to talk about their district, there, different school boards across the state are elected for different terms. They are, it's just a different structure. And that, again, shows the local control that our school boards have. So they're elected by, here, I'm going to move the little chat so I can see better. See if I can move this out of the way. They're elected by a popular vote. And the candidate has to receive 50% of the vote to win. So sometimes they're runoffs. So even though this, there's no primary for this, because again, it's not party affiliated, in some races, there may be 4, 5, 6 people running for one position. If no one person gets 50%, there may be a runoff. They can be held on the first Saturday in May or the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November. I know my district moved it to the November elections. There are pros and cons of that. When the school board elections were held in May, it was really the only thing in May. So the people who voted were often those who cared the most about it and particularly engaged on it. But it was a very small percentage of people voting, whereas come November, a lot of people vote, but they may not have done their research. So you may not get an outcome based on educated voting. So that's just my sort of input on that. Let me go back to here. So the way the Austin School Board works, we have 9 elected school board trustees, and there are 2 that are at large. That it's almost like running for mayor. There are 400,000 people who can vote on that. You need about 200,000 votes to be able to get half. It's a lot. And so, one thing to point out is it's ridiculously expensive. These are unpaid positions. And typically, and it may be different during COVID, these candidates are expected to raise between $100,000 and $150,000 to run for an at-large unpaid position. So that's just, be nice to these people, because they are working hard and there to hear you complain and hopefully serve you well. But it is a big, hard, thankless task. So there are 2 at-large trustees in Austin, and then there's 7 which are single district. And so this year, 4 are up. They stagger it so you don't get a whole new board at once. So this year, 1 of the at-larges, position 8, is up, and then 3 of the single district ones are up: District 2, District 3, and District 5. And there are maps that are on the district website. And so something that's interesting is, a lot of times people say, well, my trustee isn't up, I'm not going to worry about it, which I would advise people to approach it differently, because while you can vote for the person in your district and for the at-large members, they all vote on absolutely everything having to do with your district. So I, as an engaged voter, I try to get to know all of the school board members. Maybe the one that represents my community I know the best, but I call them all before an important vote. I reach out to all of them and educate them when there's an issue I'm concerned about, because they're all your representatives. And it's just important you have these people who are close to you that you can engage with. And again, they're making important decisions about your kids, about your community, about your neighborhoods, and they are a huge part of the greater Austin area. How goes the schools? How goes the community? Heather, do you want to talk about how it works in Eanes?
I would love to. So while Laura's bringing up that slide, I do have to say that I am here speaking tonight as an individual and not as an elected official, and I'm not representing my school board, but I am just happy to help educate. So in Eanes ISD, we do things a little bit different. We have 7 elected school board trustees, and they are staggered 3 terms. Again, unpaid. All of our school board trustees in Texas are unpaid.
Are you frozen, Heather? Did we lose you for a minute? So I'm gonna go ahead, and then when Heather unfreezes, we can come back to this slide. Zoom has been acting very strange the last couple of days. I can read this slide for Heather until she comes back to us. I think we lost her picture. Heather, are you back? You're on mute.
I'm back. Of course my internet is right then. Sorry about that.
No,
so anyways, 7 elected school board trustees in Eanes, staggered 3-year terms. We're elected in May usually, but we did push our election back till November because of COVID. We have 3 up for election on this ballot that we're supposed to be elected in May. Only 1 race is contested, but it's important that everyone pays attention to all of the races. And in Eanes ISD, like I said before, if you heard me, I might have been gone at that point. I don't know, internet issues. All trustees represent the entire district and vote on everything for every student. So it's important to pay attention. And like Laura said, to reach out and engage with all of your school board trustees.
The other thing I will mention about that is the same as, so Heather and I know each other because we're part of TANSA, which is a parents group that advocates for meaningful student assessment. In addition to expressing your concerns, it's important for us to educate our elected officials. Often we'll go to the legislature and they're supposed to know everything about everything, just like the school board. And they're really counting on the electorate to be engaged and to inform them what's going on in their schools, what's going on in their communities, what issues are happening, because they can't be everywhere. So it's sort of a symbiotic relationship between the electors and the elected. So I just think that's important to know how empowering it is to have the right to vote and be able to make these decisions.
Not only that, Laura, it's important that our elected school board members are educated by our community and by anyone else that needs to educate us, so that when we go talk to the legislators at the Capitol, we can understand and represent our community well too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so as I mentioned before, I mean, why school board elections matter is, one, they affect every little bit of every part of your life. Again, from how much money comes into your school, from, regulations to, how long you can speak at a school board meeting, what kind of special ed programs are in your school? Do you have dual language? Are there, job training programs? I mean, just so many things. They make so many decisions. And I am not on our school board, but I have great respect for them. And, it's important we're going to talk a little bit more about how to do this later, but not only do they have the most influence over you, you have the most influence over them. They are local. It is democracy in action. And I will mention, our traditional public schools, we have an elected school board. There are charters, which are called public schools. They get public money. They get tax money. They do not have an elected school board. It is not a democratically elected group. Often they are out of state. They are, not for profit here in Texas, but the management company may be. And so you don't have any control. So you need to enjoy the democracy that you get with your locally elected school board. And let's see. Yeah, I think I've hit all of the points on this one hard. I'm going to let Heather talk about some of the detailed things that I still get a little, blurry about. So I'm going to sit back and listen for a while too.
Thank you. Okay, so school district budgets and school finance in general is super complicated, but the biggest thing to know in terms of school finance and district budgets are that there are two different budgets. And I wrote all of this stuff on here for you, but it's really boring. You can read it if you want to, but I'm just gonna try to hit the highlights for you. So there's two buckets of money for public schools in their districts. There is the maintenance and operations, which is the bulk of the money where we pay our teachers and our staff. In my district, that's 85% of our M&O budget pays just salaries. The rest of it will pay utilities and other things that we have to do to keep our district open, every day. The other side is the INS, or interest and sinking budget. That is where we have our bond money and any facility improvements, and we pay our debts from that side. So those are the two pieces of the puzzle for our district budget. So tax rate is set by our local school board trustees, and that is super important because there is a way that we can balance our M&O and our debt services and how we can work those together to keep more money for our students. One thing that's really important to note is that recapture is a thing. When it started, it was great. The intent was awesome. Let's give other districts that are not wealthy, let's give them more money. But the fact of the matter is now, the Supreme Court said it's lawful but awful. But there are districts that have lower socioeconomic statuses, but they are technically a property wealthy district due to the commercial buildings and commercial properties like a mall or strip centers or office buildings that are in their areas. And so they're having to pay recapture back to the state. And that money actually just goes to the general fund. It doesn't go to other districts as intended anymore. And a lot of it, actually most of it, goes to charter schools now. You can also, it's important to note that school district taxes on residential homesteads may be frozen for people over 65 years old. So here in my district, we actually have a large number of residents who are over 65 just because it doesn't make sense for them to move. Their taxes are frozen and they've lived in the home forever. So we have a lot of over 65 voters in our area. Next slide, please. So what is a bond? So the school district trustees also decide on when a district needs a bond and then how much that bond should be for. So it's similar to a mortgage on a home. In order to get a bond, you have to get it approved by the voters. But before you do that, so in my district and in most districts, they'll have something called a bond advisory committee. And that bond advisory committee works in conjunction with the facilities people on the staff to figure out what is exactly needed. So in fast growth districts like Lake Travis or Leander, they'll be putting massive bond projects together with tons of schools. In my district, it's more stuff like HVAC systems or roofs or a new track. And we usually don't do bigger improvements, although we did just pass a bond last year for a pool, a robotics extension, and a wrestling facility. So that's exciting because we don't normally do facilities in my district. But so we had a bond oversight committee that decided this is what we need to do and this is what we're going to put on. Before you can put a bond on, you have to do all these audits, and your amount that you can get for a bond is also decided on a lot of different things in the audit, which also includes how much you have in your fund balance and your financial rating with the state. So if you aren't in good financial standing, you probably can't sell a bond anyways. So then once you decide how many buildings you're going to build or how many HVAC systems you're going to replace or how many roofs you're going to replace, you put that number, the trustees have to approve that number, and then they call it for an election. You can have a bond on a ballot without a candidate election, but in a lot of cases there are both for school districts. So again, you pay for your bonds out of your interest and sinking budget, not your M&O. And one of the most often things that I hear, or the things I hear most often is, oh my gosh, that district doesn't need any money. They're building a huge football stadium. Well, guess what? Or why can't they give their teachers raises? They're building a huge football stadium. That's not the same money. I wish that we could pass bonds to pay teachers, but unfortunately that's not the case. You can't use bond dollars to pay for salaries. So, and the bonds are secured by the permanent school fund, which is good. Next. So this is new, Vader. I think of it as Darth Vader, but it's short for a voter approved tax ratification election. Before last session, we had tax ratifications elections, but thanks to HB3, we now have a Vader. So previously, you could only have 6 golden pennies, and here's where the school finance stuff gets really weird, right? So golden pennies are not recapturable. This is a big deal for recapture districts, which the majority of our districts in the state are now recapture districts, which again was never intended. So before we could only get 6 golden pennies, which is the money that you can keep local. But now you can have 2 more, so that's exciting. So Eanes ISD is one of the first districts in the state to put a Vader on the ballot. November is the very first time that any district is able to do that. Before we did that, we had to go through another financial audit. We passed it. They said, yes, you're financially good, go ahead. So it's very interesting, this whole Vader thing, because it doesn't, the way that we're doing it in our community, and we are all about being fiscally responsible and saving our taxpayers as much money as we can. So we are actually compressing the tax rate thanks to HB3, but also we're doing a penny swap. So we're going to be swapping money from our INS bucket and our M&O bucket so that it will be the exact same tax rate no matter what happens. The goal though is to have people vote for the Vader, and again, I'm speaking as an individual taxpayer, not as a trustee here, but the goal is to have people vote for the Vader so that we can keep an additional $3 million local instead of sending it back to the state for the general fund. That doesn't help any of us, it just helps the state. So next, please. So the ballot language was, this is what they said we have to use, and basically it's really confusing and it makes it sound like no matter what we're raising taxes. Well, yes, it does raise taxes on one side, but then we're swapping it with other pennies and so it will be the same. But if you read it, it definitely says it will result in an increase of 1.8% in maintenance operations taxes, which it does. But again, we're swapping it with the INS, and that's what most districts will do. In some cases, maybe they won't, maybe they will just increase taxes, but that's not what the majority of school boards want to do. Nobody wants to raise taxes if you can avoid it. Next, please. So here is just, an example for Eanes ISD and how that works. And again, it's confusing and it's kind of boring. So I put it up there, use it if you want it, don't if you don't. But basically what it comes down to is that the rate is the same with compression, with the VADR, but it allows us to have $3 million more for our M&O budget, which is how we pay our teachers. So that's quite a few more teachers. And with the looming budget cuts coming from the state because of COVID and gas and all the other craziness, I think districts are going to need every penny that they can possibly get. Next, please. So this is just some examples of what happens with and without the golden pennies. Again, you can see budget cuts are looming. Everybody thinks that Eanes is like the super wealthy district and we have all this money. We actually don't. We're actually in a major budget crunch. So you can tell, our fund balance dips down every year. We're going to have to make staff cuts. If we don't pass the golden pennies, we may have to look at all of our programs. We're probably going to have to do some of that anyways. But if we can get the golden pennies, you can see that at least we don't have to dip into our fund balance as much. Next, please. Oh, you're muted, Laura.
Okay, so I'm going to come back. I'm just going to say, I really appreciate that Heather explained that because I had never heard of some of those terms, and I do a lot with school funding. The one other thing I'll add, just to help people understand the whole, word recapture, otherwise known as Robin Hood, the way it's determined is it's a very simple fraction. It is the number of students divided by the value of the property taxes in your district. So while Austin, for example, does not have the highest property tax rate, it raises a lot of money because we have very valuable property. So as a child chooses not, if a parent doesn't send a kid to school this year because of COVID, or if a parent sends the kid to a charter, the number at the top goes down. Or if they're gentrified out and move to Pflugerville or somewhere else, there are fewer and fewer kids on the top. But the value of our land, not the rate of our taxes, the value of our land is going up. So that makes it, when you divide the number of kids by the value, it makes it look like each kid is getting a ton of money and is rich. And so Austin sends the most money back to the state of any district. It was $800 million a couple years ago, might be down a little from House Bill 3. And not to say that other districts don't, there are districts that are taxing at the very highest rate, but don't have any taxable value. So they are trying to milk something that's dry. They do need the money. Our state is not, we are 43rd in funding our schools. And so this is a lot of weight being put on the local property taxpayers that get sent in to the state to be distributed among other districts. And as Heather mentioned, that money that gets sent in is not all being used for public education. It was almost $4 billion that were sent in for public ed through local property taxes that were not used for education last time. So a lot of taxpayers get mad and say we're spending all this money, and they get mad at the school board, while the school board is trying to keep tax rates low, while the school board is trying to help all of the other districts. But really, this is where it gets into school boards can do some, but this is where it's important to vote for the state legislature and pay attention to the governor and the lieutenant governor, because these decisions about who's paying what and who's, what you can do with your taxes, that comes at all different levels of government. So it's just a good little government lesson. And then the details Heather explained about what money you can use to build a building versus what money you can use to pay a teacher are different buckets of money, and they cannot be, you can't commingle those funds. So
hey, Laura, it's also important to note too that Austin ISD has the lowest tax rate in all of Central Texas. Eanes ISD is the second lowest. That's pretty important to note that, those two school boards and others are really working hard to keep those taxes down.
And then some of our rural areas, they've had to make it really high, but they still can't get much out of it because they don't have businesses or they don't have
malls,
valuable property. Yeah, it's a very confusing thing, and that's something that's unique really a unique pressure to Texas because we don't have an income tax. We have a two-legged stool and most states have a three-legged stool. So anyway, that's more about taxes than you want to know, but it explains how who gets to decide what. They're interdependent. So I do run, you'll see in the background, Texas Educators Vote. It's just a group that we encourage educators to model civic engagement for students, and the League of Women Voters of Texas is one of our partners. We use Vote 411. It's all about, Texas is usually last or almost last in voter turnout. And so we want people to be educated and informed voters. So if you want to learn more, for example, so we encourage people, one, to register. The last day to register is Monday. So go check it out. Make sure, go to Travis County or whatever your county is, check and see if you're registered, because if you want to send your registration and send it straight to your county elections officials, but it has to get there by Monday or postmarked Monday. Heather, which one is it?
I think it has to be postmarked by Monday.
So like on our Texas Educators Vote website, which is texaseducatorsvote.com, we have a spot where you register or you can research. And when we say research, it leads to places. It leads to Vote 411, which is the League of Women Voters. Awesome. Figure out what's on your ballot, compare your candidates, find out, who you like best, and then bring it with you. And then there's also Teach the Vote, which asks education specific questions. It's part of the Association of Texas Professional Educators. And they ask every legislative and state board of education candidate. They don't all answer, but they ask them all, their views on various public education issues. So for those are great places to research. For school board, we can give you examples. So I'm part of a group called AISD for All, where we have just held 4 candidate forums. We asked very specific education questions related to the specific districts, related to equity, related to the district at large, of all the candidates. And if you go to the AISD for All website, they've broken out each candidate's answers for each of the different questions. So if you're interested in standardized testing, you can see what each of the candidates has to say. If you're interested in an equity audit, really anything that you want to know. So it's a good way to research it for that. Heather, if you want to talk about the one that you put up for Eanes.
Yeah, there are several groups, but Eanes is a little bit smaller and a little bit different in the way that it works, but there are some Facebook groups that are backing candidates or that are giving information about candidates. Eanes Strong is a group that's been open to everyone and has been good about engaging with candidates. And we also have our last candidate forum this Sunday that's hosted by the Westlake Chamber of Commerce. And if anyone's interested in joining that, that's happening at 2 o'clock on Zoom.
Awesome. Yeah, and AISD for All isn't endorsing anyone. There are a ton of groups endorse almost every, neighborhood group, political group. You can find endorsements all over the place. But if you that's why I put up AISD for All, because it's non-political, it's nonpartisan, it's just asks questions and lets you do your own. I will only give nonpartisan sources.
There's also Texans for Public Education, which is a great nonpartisan source to get information about candidates and just how they vote incumbents, how they vote, and then candidates.
That's state level. They're not going to do school board, right?
They do school board.
Oh, well, they do school board.
Well, I'm sorry, they do State Board of Education. They don't local.
So yeah. At top level, yes.
Yes.
And then social media, again, social media, there are all sorts of groups in the greater Austin area that if you go on there and you do look at certain hashtags related to education or related to voting, you can find more than you would ever want. And then just in general for all elections, candidate forums are a great way to learn about the people. These are people that are going to sit on the dais once a week, once a month, twice a month. And it's just a great way. These candidate forums are often taped, especially with Zoom, and you can look at them and you can just get an inkling of, who you think you appreciate the most and who you think reflects your values. Local newspapers, I know the Chronicle came out with their endorsements yesterday. I think the Statesman, I don't think theirs is out yet. I don't know what other Austin area papers are going to be doing endorsements. I don't think Impact does it, Heather? No. And then associations and advocacy groups that you respect. So this is just sort of about the research part. You've registered hopefully before now. If not, TikTok, let's go. And then it's time to do the research and then, get your Vote 411 ready. And as everybody knows, you cannot bring your phone into the voting booth in Texas. And so you need to make sure you write down your selections, unless you've got like a steel trap for a mind, which I don't, so I write mine down. And then let's just see, we've just got a little more. Through my Texas Educators Vote, I've got text reminders. I sent one out yesterday, just reminding people that the registration deadline was Monday. I don't send very many, but I'll send people one. It's time for early voting. It's educator voting day. It's student voting day. Just a handful to remind people. So for that, you can text Ed Vote to 40649, and then you'll get very few but important reminders. And I know the league does great reminders too.
Hey, Laura, before you wrap that part up, I think it's also important to note that both Austin ISD and Eanes ISD gave November 3rd as a holiday for staff. Well, I don't know about AISD if it's staff, but it's staff and students in Eanes ISD, so that everybody can make sure to go vote. And anyone over the age of 16 can actually apply to be a poll worker. So that's exciting if anyone needs some extra cash, or if a high school student over the age of 16 wants to get involved, that's a great way. So exciting. And also
get paid, right?
I'm sorry?
I think well, at least the high school election workers can get paid.
Yes.
For their work. And it's a great way to get young people engaged. I'm not sure whether, I know Austin made it a holiday, and I'm not sure if it's for staff or not, but one thing that's really important about that is for COVID, they really have been looking for large places where people can do social distancing and do safe voting. There are a lot of places that we've used forever. They just can't spread people out enough. So by doing that and having all these enormous buildings available, it's really going to help us have more polling locations. So I am greatly appreciative of the districts that are doing that. The other thing I will mention, I know Austin did it before, I think Denton's doing it, but on a call earlier today, the League of Women Voters of Texas reminded us to encourage districts to put voting in just dates and times on the marquees of the schools. Even if the kids aren't there in person, people drive by, just to get as many people to remember, hey, it's time, I need to go. I need to vote, or I got to mail in my ballot or drop off my ballot, or whichever way you're voting. It's just so important. There's so much on the ballot.
So much. Keep scrolling, people. Everybody keep scrolling. Your SBOE stuff is towards the bottom. Your school board races are towards the bottom. And the Vader or bonds are even further down. So please keep scrolling all the way to the end.
Mm-hmm. So just, I didn't introduce myself. I'm Laura Yeager. I do run this Texas Educators Vote. I work with a couple other advocacy groups that advocate for funding our public schools, for reducing high stakes testing. I'm part of this new AISD for All. I'm happy to talk to anyone at all about public education, about voting. My contact information is there. You can sign up for my voter updates on our Texas Educators Vote website. But above all, our democracy is stronger when more people engage. And I will say, in the state of Texas, our TEACs, which the State Board of Education write, every single solitary year in the social studies curriculum from kindergarten through 12th grade. And I sat with a cup of tea and read these TEACs. It talks about civic engagement, civics, and voting. And so we need to model what we're teaching our kids. And if we do, the kids will grow up and be voters, and we maybe won't be last in voter turnout, and the kids will get the democracy they deserve. So here, I'm going to turn to Heather.
And if you don't know what a TEAC is, it's a Texas Essential Knowledge and Skills. And that's basically what teachers have to teach. So thank you for that, Laura. I always get that question, what's a TEAC? So thought I'd clarify that.
Yeah. And again, I know there are several positions on the State Board of Education, and they write those. And what our State Board of Education writes is often in the national news. It sometimes is driven more by politics than by, what's the word, Heather? Than anything else. And so it's really important who you pick to put in any of the elected positions. And so we really appreciate, being invited to talk today. Do you have anything else, Heather?
No, I'm just like Laura said, I'm always open to talking. I love public education. I'm a pub ed junkie. And so I'm happy to talk anytime. And if anybody's thinking about running for school board or just wants more information about that, I am always happy to chat about that. Both Laura and I love talking about testing and, accountability. So we're always happy to chat about that too. So anything that I can help with, reach out. And shout out to the League of Women Voters for these awesome, cute bags. I got mine delivered and I love it so much. It's so cute. So thank you, League of Women Voters, for having me.
So are there any questions you guys have, or is there anything else we can do that we didn't make sense about, or that we didn't answer that you wanted to hear about?
I know it's a super exciting topic.
It is, and it's Friday evening at 5:30. There may be more people out like drinking a margarita and enjoying this breathtaking day, although it is full of ragweed and mold. So
it is gorgeous.
It is beautiful out and we should enjoy it while we can. So I just want to say thank you again for inviting us. It's, you know, it's not a sexy topic, but it's really, really, really important. And I know at least in Austin, this is a pivotal moment and we can make or break our district based on what our board does and if we pick the right people. So thank you guys. Thank you again.
Thank you. Have a great weekend and go vote soon.